Hello and welcome back to the Ask Abhijit show. I hope you're all doing fantastic. You're all doing great. Today is episode 192, and I'm going to take a bunch of questions from you about various matters of interest. So, as always, let's see who all is on the live chat. I can see Lucifer, Sainik Hill, FFARG, Shagun Chopra, Vishnu Mohanan, Tejo Meg, Argya Chakrabarti, Lelouch, Vishaka Kabila, Ralla Avinash, Om Bekerikar, Sonu Prashant, Harsh Agarwal, Arsh, Clash with Pushkar, So Amraj, Zubon Izang, S. Lodi, Somijit Mukherjee, Harshal Agarwal, Threadripper, Matrix, Jang Daman, Prathamesh, Anant Pai, Red, Ubendran, Shri Ramachandraya Namaha, Somesh Verma, Niharika Gupta, Lucifer again, Tushar Akhan Bharat, Vladimir Aditinath, hello, Tejo Meg, Amanjot Singh, Rohit Jangid, Bibekananda Panda, Suryakant Dagar, Geopolitical Dube, Anand Pai, Astral Harp, Vishnu Mohanan, Raghuvir Solanki, Sujin B, Jang Daman, Arsh, Anand Mahesh, Dollar, Navin Kumar, Somijit, Maklevin, Birdie Nam Nam, Sushant Pandey, you've seen the movie, haven't you? Vladimir Aditinath, Space KGB Agent Ankit Shingne, Dheeraj Kamath, Astral Harp, and everybody else. Welcome to the live stream. I really appreciate you being here. Ranjit Troll from Nepal, hello. Kunal, Aishwarya, Samruddh, Ranjit, History, X Mythology, Anand Chandrasekharan, Gaming Lover, Ojas, Miguel Diaz, hi, Insanely Boy, and everybody else. Shivani, Himanshu, Chirag, Tushar, everybody else. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the live stream. So I'm going to take a bunch of questions from that you've asked in the comments, and after that, I'll take a number of questions from the live chat itself. So let us begin with question number one. What is question number one? What do we have today? Let's see. It's by Surinder Gupta. Is the petrodollar deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States over? What are the implications? Yes, so the news came out recently, about a week ago or so, that the petrodollar deal that Saudi Arabia had signed with the US is now officially over. The Saudis have chosen not to revive or continue that agreement. And this agreement was signed in 1974 for the first time. And what was the agreement? The petrodollar agreement. The agreement was that Saudi Arabia would sell its petroleum only with the US dollar as the currency. It would only accept US dollars when it would sell petroleum. So this made the US dollar, it entrenched the US dollar and solidified the US dollar's position as the world's reserve currency and the main currency or only currency in which you could trade in petroleum. So that is something that allowed the US to establish its primacy, its supremacy, and so on worldwide in the 20th century. And now this is over. So the implications are that, first of all, what does it mean that this deal is over? And in exchange for the Saudis agreeing to use the US dollar only as a currency, the Americans gave them a lot of economic benefits, military aid. All Saudi Arabian army weapons, military weapons are US weapons, US made weapons, and so on. So the Saudis became a loyal, let's say, ally of the US, and they got lots of benefits in exchange for making the US dollar the only currency in which they would trade in oil. So that was the deal. Now that deal is over. So what does that mean? It means the Saudis will now sell petroleum, oil, and they will accept other currencies apart from the US dollar as well. So what currencies could these be? It could be the ruble, the Russian ruble, the Chinese yuan, the euro, possibly the Indian rupee, even currencies like Bitcoin, etc. could be accepted by the Saudis. So that is what it means. That's the immediate implications of that. And that obviously diminishes the value of the US dollar internationally, doesn't it? So does it mean that the US dollar is doomed? And does it mean that the US dollar's value will fall? Will it depreciate? What could happen? And why is the US seemingly okay with this? I mean, the US is the world's preeminent power, is the sole superpower. It has destroyed entire nations for less. So why is it okay with the Saudis going ahead with ending the petrodollar agreement? Um, I I get the feeling that this could be part of a script. There is a script, it seems like to me, that is being played out right now. And this could have something to do with technological advancements, the rise of artificial intelligence, AI, the rise of technologies like blockchain, the blockchain ledger, all that. When certain momentous changes happen technologically or geopolitically, you will see them either being there could be downstream effects, or there could be effects of that before it actually happens. For example, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR eventually crumbled, a tremendous amount of geopolitical changes happened in those years. In the early 90s, late 80s, etc., new nations were formed, and a lot of stuff happened. The uh, Central Asian republics became independent. Yugoslavia was broken up, and lots of things happened. There were downstream effects in Africa as well. So, with the advent of technologies like blockchain, with the US becoming the AI superpower, I believe that the US may be on the verge of soon, possibly, rolling out a digital dollar, a digital currency. And maybe the EU and all Western nations may participate in that. And that would obviously naturally be controlled from the US. So the US essentially will own and control this currency. That's what I think. And when this currency is rolled out, a digital currency, then you don't really need the US dollar. I mean, you can phase it out slowly. So I don't think the US will allow its supremacy, its primacy, global primacy and superpower status, and its currency status as the world's reserve currency to just slip away like that, especially at the hands of Saudi Arabia, which you could say is, whether you like it or not, it's a US vassal. It's been one since, well, the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century. So the Saudis, as I'm sure you will understand, will do nothing that will displease the US significantly. You may remember that when the Jamal Khashoggi incident happened, uh, the Americans in the West hounded and humiliated the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He was treated very, very poorly whenever he went to some G20 or whatever event. He was marginalized, he was sidelined, nobody would speak to him. Only Mr. Putin and Mr. Modi would speak to him, and so on. So the Saudis know full well what can happen, what will happen if they uh, challenge the US in any way whatsoever. Every nation knows that. No nation can stand up to the US today. The US can destroy entire nations like that. So I think this is part of a script. I think we're going to see a move to digital currencies, and those digital currencies, whether it's a basket of currencies or a single currency, will be controlled by the US, owned by the US. And maybe this is the beginning of that phase. So I don't think it poses a significant challenge to US to the US superpower status, to the US supremacy, etc. I think it's part of a script that's being played out right now. Okay, next question. Anantapal says, Namaskar, what's your take on the Indian army getting Nagastra 1, the indigenously made kamikaze drone? Some reports say that the army is planning to get 5,000 of these drones in the next 3 years. I think it's a good step. I'm glad to see this progress happening. Uh, the 21st century warfare is different compared to the 19th century warfare. We have seen uh, how things are happening differently in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and also the Ukraine war. Obviously, the lessons of the Ukraine war have to be heeded. The battlefield environment, the battle space environment is very different today in the 21st century. All these new technologies coming in, and loitering munitions, suicide drones, kamikaze drones, whatever you want to call them, are a very important part of the new battlefield environment. So these drones are typically 10, 12, 15 kilograms in weight. Lightweight things. You can lift them with one hand. Okay, 10, 12 kilos. I think the Nagastra one is about 12 kilos in weight, and the warhead it carries, or the ammunition it carries, would be about 3 to 4 kilos, maybe 3 kilos. So the explosive charge is basically just 2 or 3 kilos, 3 kilos maybe. So that, what does it do? It takes out individuals. It's an anti-personnel weapon, or maybe it can take out small vehicles as well. So I've not seen the details. I'm sure a 3 kilogram explosive charge can take out a small to medium vehicle, or at least cripple or disable it. For example, a personal carrier, a jeep, maybe even a tank if you hit it in the right spot, maybe at the top from the turret or whatever. So I'm glad this is happening. I believe this drone, this loitering drone, has an endurance of about 30 minutes. So 30 minutes it can fly, which is along the same lines as the various drones that are being used in the Ukraine conflict. So it's the same class of drone, and I'm sure it's been tested and now it's being inducted. I'm glad to see that. uh 5,000 in the next 3 years. Well, I think you should ramp up the numbers a bit, or maybe it's just the first iteration of a loitering drone. uh, and I think it's being manufactured by a private company. So I hope many more such weapon systems are developed in India. And what I hope our planners and strategists understand is that we need large quantities of these things. So I can understand if the first iteration of this weapon, you only acquire 5,000 of these over the next 3 years. But once you have a fully robust, and you can say final system, that is the right thing you can take in a battlefield, then you need large quantities of that. Because if you have a war, let's say, with whoever, let's say you have a two-front war. On the one hand, you have Pakistan. On the other hand, you have China and Chinese occupied Tibet. Then to fight these two nations, you're gonna need lots and lots of these assets. So overall, I would say great progress. I'm glad to see that India is not being left behind. We have tremendous engineers in India. We have lots of private companies that can do wonderful work. We should become a technological superpower. Forget about being a geopolitical superpower right now. Let's become a technological superpower, major power, drone manufacturing, and other stuff. And I think we are seeing steps being taken in that direction. So, overall, great job. And let's continue. McLovin says, do you think the whole Manipur war is funded to cut the eastern part from India? Maybe it was planned all the way back in 47. Look, let's understand what's happening. Forget about the 1947 angle. The whole process began in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. I've spoken about this multiple times, so I will not repeat myself. Now, what's happened? Look, I've been saying this for the past 1 year, okay, since May last year, that this is a geopolitical issue. It's not a law and order problem. It's not some kind of, some tribal group demanding justice or whatever. It's not a local law and order problem. This is a geopolitical issue that India is facing. I've been saying this for the past 1 year, and now there is corroboration of that. And my entire premise is that this conflict is being funded by the same forces that created the conflict, the problem, by settling foreigners in India beginning in the 19th century. The British started this process of settling foreigners, cookies, inside India by force. Okay, forcibly. It was not done with the will and the consent of the people of Manipur, the indigenous people of Manipur. So these cookies were settled over time, and after 1947, after 1949, the Indian government also continued the same stupid practice, because the Indian government has to blindly ape the West, right? If the British had some policies, they must have been good policies. So the Indian government continued the same stupid policies. The Indian government actually went ahead and Christianized the whole significant portion of the northeast, of the far east of India. Entire states, entire regions have been totally Christianized. And so on. So you know what happens when a region gets Christianized. The Chinese understand this very well. The Japanese understood this in the 19th, 17th century. The Chinese also. And so that brings in external geopolitical influence in the region. Now, what's happening? Now, you may have heard about what Sheikh Hasina said recently. So let's put that on the screen. Sheikh Hasina, what she said. She said, without naming the foreign nation, she said that a foreign nation wants an airbase in Bangladesh to carve out a Christian state. So these are two separate things. They want, one, an airbase, and two, they want to carve out a Christian state from, not just Bangladesh, but also Myanmar. And she did not refer to India, but I assure you, it means India also. And when we talk about India, it means Manipur and also Mizoram, by the way. Also Mizoram. Do not forget Mizoram. So that's what she has said. And she said that she was offered a smooth re-election campaign by a white-skinned man if she allowed the country to build an airbase in Bangladesh. So, which tribal group wants to create a Christian nation in out of Bangladesh, out of Burma, out of India? It is the Cookies. The Cookies are a tribal group that is not even Burmese. They do not speak the Burmese language. They don't practice Burmese customs or culture, and they owe no allegiance to Burma. They came from further east, maybe the Yunnan region, which is currently part of China or some other part of the world. And they are fighting three nations: Burma, Bangladesh, and India. And in India, it's mainly the people of Manipur are the victims. They are under siege, and more than half of Manipur has been taken over by cookies because the entire state is there's an undemarcated no, the border is demarcated, but it's an unfenced border. It's an open border with a free passage regime, and that problem was not created, what has been around for decades. So the current government, listen, for whatever its faults, the current government has not created the solution. Mr. Modi's government has not created the situation. They have inherited this problem. Maybe they could have been more alert. Maybe they should have known what could be coming. But well, so there you have it. Now, so the Americans want. Let's just name them. The Americans want to carve out a Christian nation out of Bangladesh, Myanmar, and parts of India. A Christian nation. So let us go to the map, my dear friends, and let me explain what the situation is. Let's just speak openly today. See, India is becoming too large for its boots. India is progressing too fast. So the British created an artificial Islamic nation out of the western regions of India, Pakistan, the world's number one exporter of terrorism, which still stands today for now. And now the Americans, who have inherited power from the British Empire, who are the continuation of the British Empire, want to carve out a Christian nation to the east of India, out of Burma, out of parts of Bangladesh, and out of some Indian states. So technically, the parts of the Indian states, Far East states that will be part of this nation, Kukiland, Zalingam, whatever you want to call it, they will technically be part of India, but they'll be administered separately. That situation is already there today. Large parts of Manipur are lawless. They are being administered by the ragtag tribals, and the Indian government does not have much say there. So the Americans want to carve out a Christian Pakistan from Burma, Bangladesh, and parts of the far east of India, mainly Manipur, but other states will also be kind of touched by that, and some other states' territory will also be part of that. You could say perhaps Mizoram could be involved in that. All right. And let's not even talk about Mizoram right now because it's a whole Pandora's box. And the Americans also want an island from the Bangladeshis. So I have spoken at length about the British Indian Ocean Territory, which is actually controlled and operated by the Americans. The Diego Garcia military base. The Americans have a large Air Force station over here, and they also have a massive naval base here, which can accommodate entire aircraft carriers. So that allows the Americans to project power in the Indian Ocean region and apply pressure in this region whenever they need. Now they want another such station in the Bay of Bengal. So which island do they want? They want this Bangladeshi island over here. I believe it's called Saint Martin's Island or something like that. Yeah, Saint Martin's Island. So it is a Bangladeshi island, but it's off the coast of Burma. And it's a reasonably well-sized island. The Americans could build an Air Force base over here as well as a naval base here. And that will allow them to pressurize every nation in this region, especially the nation that is the center of focus, which is India. So now you may ask me, why isn't the Indian government doing anything about this? Why isn't the Indian government pushing back against the cookies and the foreign involvement in Manipur? Here's what will happen, my dear friends. The moment the Indian government takes any real action against the cookies who are terrorizing the natives of Manipur, here's what will happen. The moment the Indian government dares to take any action, the Americans will accuse India of large scale wide ranging human rights abuses. And they will impose the same kind of sanctions on India, the kinds of sanctions they have imposed on Burma as well as Cuba. And they will destroy the Indian economy and bring India down to the level of Cuba. Okay? So Mr. Modi has a choice. What do we do? What do you do? The Americans are too powerful. There's nothing India can do if they want to break India into pieces. Absolutely nothing. Nothing. So the best solution is to have as little damage as possible. Okay? That is the situation we are staring at today. So it is entirely possible that by the end of this decade, there could be a Christian nation, a Christian Pakistan in the far east of India. And some parts of that nation will be taken from Manipur. And even Mizoram could be part of that because they are essentially the same people. Mizos, Zomis, same thing. So this is the game. Sheikh Hasina has spoken about this. She has not spoken about Manipur. She has not spoken about India. But learn to read between the lines. Don't be like at the level of seventh standard. Learn to read between the lines. That is the deal. The Americans want to, so that they can. Pakistan is not enough now for India. We need two such terror nations to keep India completely hemmed in. Look at this. Look at the map. So you will have Pakistan on the west and this Kuki nation on the east. Burma will be disintegrated into pieces. Okay, Burma is almost doomed now. And you will have two nations one on India's eastern side, one on India's western side. And India will be completely cut off from Southeast Asia. We have plans to build roads and railways. All that will be over. We are already cut off from Central Asia and Europe in Eurasia by Pakistan and Chinese occupied Tibet. So the only recourse India will have is to go by sea or go by air. India is essentially a landlocked nation almost because of these things. And the Americans are now actively creating an artificial nation in the eastern part of India. And they wanted Sheikh Hasina to be part of that. Obviously, she did not agree, and she has actually been very courageous and she's spoken about this. And maybe she will pay some price for that. The Americans don't forgive anyone who does that. But yeah, so the reason she has been able to stay in power is because of Indian support in Bangladesh. So the punishment for that is that Bangladesh itself will be broken now. That's where we are. We'll keep tracking this. All right. Okay, Malik Said says, in the future, if a war happens between India and China, then is it possible that rather than helping India, the Americans will try to engineer a breakup of India so that they shall eliminate a big upcoming threat? Also, is it the best scenario in the American interest in which China and India go to war, resulting in a unipolar world order? Will China and India show maturity in this case against the West? You ask a very good question, my friend. If there's a war between India and China, it will be a win-win situation for the Americans because both are nuclear armed states. Both will possibly incur significant damage if the war goes on beyond a certain amount of time, if there's no quick ceasefire. And that could help the Americans immensely because China is currently the biggest threat from the economic perspective, the manufacturing and all so on and so forth perspective for the US. The Russians are the biggest military threat for the US, and India is the one long-term emerging threat for the US from their perspective. We don't threaten anybody, but they see anybody who's emerging as a threat to them because they don't want any emerging power in the world, the Americans. So if India and China go to war, they will try and impose conditions on India. They're okay, we're willing to help you, but here are the conditions. And I have made an entire video about that. So do I have it somewhere open? You can check it out. You can check it out. I have a video on this channel about what demands the Americans will make in exchange for help against China. And even if they eventually do help India, it will be minimal help, which will essentially ensure that India emerges from this war situation significantly diminished. So they are not anyone's friends. They are nobody's friends. They're not even Australia or the UK's friends. They're no one's friends. They are the sole superpower, and they want to maintain that status. When you are the sole superpower, you're jealous. You're jealous of anyone who is potentially going to emerge. So yeah, so if the war happens, it will be great for them. The ideal situation for the US is that India and China blow each other's brains out and totally destroy each other, and then they can peacefully deal with Russia in their own sweet time. That's the ideal situation for them. So what should India and China do? I mean, China needs to behave a little bit. We don't threaten China. They have been antagonizing India. They have been trying to bite around at India's territory, and now that India is being ramping up infrastructure development in the northern parts, in the Tibet bordering regions, they go ahead with this Galwan clash and whatnot. It is entirely their fault that the situation is bad. The relations between the two nations are bad. It's China's fault. They're also pressuring other nations. They're trying to interfere in Nepal. They're trying to bully Bhutan. So the Chinese have themselves to blame for their bad relationship with India. They have steadfastly refused to demarcate the India-Tibet border for decades. We didn't. It's not our fault. It's their fault. So I think it is the Chinese who need to show some amount of maturity. And eventually, you keep on doing that, you're gonna see consequences. So they have been renaming parts of India to Chinese names. Now India has gone ahead and renamed parts of Tibet to Indian names, or Indian to names that we have decided. So you know what that means. When the Indian government officially goes ahead and renames 30 places in Tibet, what does it mean? It means that India has reopened the Tibet issue. Understand that. Who is to blame for this? Are we to blame for that? No, the Indian government has done the right thing. So I think the Chinese need to demonstrate some amount of maturity. They have been behaving in a very childish manner, a very immature manner. They should understand that India is not a threat to them. India doesn't threaten China. India doesn't claim Chinese territory. India has never started a war with China. India, the past 2,000 years, has given so much to China without asking anything in return. And I think that is something that irks them actually with Chinese Communist Party. Um, I hope that India and China don't go to war. I hope the Chinese don't start a war. If a war happens between India and China, it will be started by the Chinese, not by India. It is in both nations' interests not to go to war. And I hope that China will show maturity in this matter. But the Chinese seem to see the world from a zero sum perspective, that for them to win, everybody else has to lose. They don't want to coexist peacefully with anybody. They have been pressurizing Russia also. They have renamed some parts of Russia as well. Yeah. So the problem is the Chinese Communist Party. So, so if the two nations go to war, it's going to only end up benefiting the West. It's going to end up benefiting the US. So I hope that mature minds will prevail in China. India has behaved maturely. India has shown the utmost restraint thus far. So I hope China will show some maturity. I will appeal to the Chinese government today. Please show some maturity. India is not your enemy. India is your elder brother civilizationally. All right? And we need to get along, because in the long run we have to coexist. India is not going anywhere. India is not going anywhere, no matter how much you desire that. So show some maturity and let's get along. Okay, next question is by Shravan. Earlier, there were plans for a north-south trade corridor from which India could get access to Europe for trade, but then the US and Iran sanctions slowed it, and now even even Armenia is not stable. Then last year, the US came up with the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and soon after that, a conflict started with Hezbollah and Hamas and Israel. So, do you think that all the major powers don't want India to get a trade route with Europe? You see, India is a growing economy. And if India keeps on growing at 6, 7, 8%, whatever percentage per year for the next 20 years, first of all, in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years maximum, India is going to be the third largest economy in the world. It's going to be the US, China, India. And if India keeps growing the way it is growing, then India could eventually, by 2050, perhaps even surpass China. That is a big problem for the West. This nation, this civilization that they had almost destroyed, stamped out, sucked everything out of, It is still alive, and now it's again emerging out of the debris, out of the destruction caused by the British. And there is this resurgence of some kind of national pride in India. Most Indians are still deeply mentally colonized and deracinated, but there is some pride that's re-emerging in India, and that sets off alarm bells in the West. So yes, it is not in their interest if India does well. They want to utilize India in certain ways. India has limited utility, like I've said, for the West. They would like India to be an exporter of services, not goods. Or if India exports goods, then it should be only the goods that they desire. They don't want India to become a major manufacturing power. They would like to outsource the manufacturing now, not anymore to China. They want to seek other options, but maybe Vietnam and other countries, but hopefully not India. They don't want to turn India into the next China. And uh, and obviously they would like to use India as a counterbalance to China, but they would like to counterbalance India also with Pakistan and in a new nation called Kukiland. So they are not India's friends. They don't want to see India develop infrastructure, trade routes, supply chains, etc. with Europe. India has been very nicely isolated the past 70, 80 years. I mean, look at the map. Why was Pakistan created? To cut India off from Eurasia. India historically has had thousands of years of connections with Central Asia and Europe and Eurasia. That has been entirely cut off thanks to the great, wonderful founding fathers of India who accepted this in 1947. So India is completely cut off from Eurasia. So what India can do is we can, take the help of nations, friendly nations like Iran, and go through ports like Chabahar. There is a port called Chabahar here, and we can access Afghanistan, bypassing Pakistan, and even access Central Asia and Europe. And Iran was to be one of the staging points for the, like you say, the north south international north south transport and trade corridor. But that's the Americans would not like that to go ahead. The other one, the Middle East IMEC, India Middle East Europe trade corridor, it's not happening right now because of the Hamas Israel war. And India recently acquired the Chabahar port on a lease of 10 years, at least one terminal, and the Americans threatened sanctions against India once this happened. So it's very clear that the US, forget about the major powers, there are no major powers in the West. There's only one major power in the West, which is the US. And all other Western powers are vassals of the US, the puppets. So the Americans do not want to see India grow. They do not want to see, forget about rising, they don't want India to grow at all. India should be cut down to size, and this Kukiland thing, this new nation thing, is all a means of doing that. So yes, you are right. The only thing I would like to amend is that there are no Western major powers. There's only one major power in the West. It's the US, and they do not want to see India grow. They don't want to see India rise. They want to cut India down to size and use India for specific purposes, for the limited utility they have for India, and that's it. So it's going to be challenging for India. How does India deal with this? So you either just give in to the West and just allow them to use you in whatever way you want, which means that you will eventually become the next Japan and you'll be destroyed. Or you resist, but then you pay some price for that. So these are the big dilemmas that Mr. Modi has to grapple with. So yes, they invite Mr. Modi to the G7 summit. They give him a center position and all that. But there's a price. There's a price, and so on the one hand, they're shaking hands with you. On the other hand, they're twisting a knife in your back at the same time. That's what's happening, and you got to smile and shake hands while a knife is being twisted in your back. That is international relations. That is geopolitics. That is diplomacy. Geopolitics is the rule of the jungle. Okay, Priyanka Taneja says, could you talk about how does a powerful leader like Vladimir Putin operate? Considering the constant threat of assassination at any given point in time, surely he would have lots of internal enemies apart from the usual external ones. So, considering the constant threat of assassination, how does he manage to remain safe, keep all his state secrets intact, and continue leading his nation? Okay, so this applies to not just Vladimir Putin, it applies to Xi Jinping, it applies to Narendra Modi, it applies to whoever is the the president of the US, and it applies to all major world leaders, the ones that really matter. In the case of the US, the president, well, in 63, a president was assassinated, nothing much changed. But when it comes to real world leaders, so in the US, what I mean is that the president isn't really the person who holds real power. The president, like Douglas Adams said, his job is to distract people, the public, from where the real power lies. So the US president is essentially Zaphod Beeblebrox, in case you know what I mean. Anyway, when it comes to real world leaders like Mr. Putin, like Mr. Xi Jinping, like Mr. Modi, even Mr. Macron, etc., they always face the possibility that somebody would want to assassinate them. The threat has to be considered as a 24/7 threat. As long as, at least if you are the security people of the leader, Mr. Putin, Mr. Modi, Mr. Xi, whoever it is, you have to consider that the leader is under constant 24/7 threat of assassination. So there are measures that are taken to ensure that such a thing doesn't happen. And so when it comes to the security and all that stuff, I would suggest that you read the Arthashastra. Where is it? Somewhere here behind me. Okay. So in the Arthashastra, Vishnugupta Chanakya writes about this, that what are the threats that the emperor usually has to live under, and what are the countermeasures, what are the mitigating actions and processes that you need to have to ensure the security of the emperor. What are the cordons of security he needs to have, and so on. He was referring to Vishnu. He was referring to Chandragupta Maurya, obviously, but later emperors like Ashok, etc., would also have even more enhanced security. So you need to have spies, you need to have intelligence, you need to have multiple cordons of security. Everybody needs to be under surveillance. Even your own people need to be under surveillance. One spies on this guy, the other guy spies on that guy, that sort of thing. This actually happens in the world. Okay, we may not see it, we may be completely oblivious to it, but in the real world, when it comes to that level of leadership, it is all there. Okay, so Vladimir Putin, obviously, like what Chanakya writes, even the food has to be tested. Every single meal has to be tasted by somebody else, and you wait for half an hour, and if that somebody else is fine, then you go ahead and give it to the leader, and so on. And today you have slow acting poison, so that you have to be even more careful. Like, poison may act after what, 72 hours, after a week, who knows. Slow acting, long lasting poisons, uh, and so on. So there's a lot that goes into the security of a leader. So that ensures that the leader is safe, and there is state secrecy, how to keep things classified, how to keep multiple levels of classification secret, above secret, top secret, above top secret, and so on. And what are the measures what are the protocols for each layer of secrecy, and so on. You only give out information on a need to know basis. I think even normal people need to understand this, but normal people won't understand that. Even those who are not leaders, even those who are not in government, need to understand that you give information only on a need to know basis. You don't give information for free to everybody. I'm talking about personal information. Okay, that's what I mean. So all that is, there are protocols, there are processes for all these things. So that's how it's done. It's very complicated. It is very high stakes. But yes, every nation has its own protocols, its own processes, its own procedures, its own sets of personnel that handle all these things. And that's how a leader is kept safe and functioning at the highest level. And all the state secrets remain secrets, and so on. And then when a leader travels, there's a whole entourage that travels with the leader, not just the political entourage and the communications people and all that, but also security personnel at various levels. You go to a foreign country and you check into a hotel. Obviously you'll check into a hotel somewhere. Then the entire hotel can be commanded by the people of that nation, by the security personnel, or at least a couple of floors above and below the floor on which the leader is staying. The entire place is swept down for security measures. Bugs, you test for bugs, test for whatnot, and so on. So it's very detailed, it's very intricate, it's very laborious, but that's what needs to be done, especially when it comes to the security of a leader that genuinely matters, not fake leaders who are replaceable, disposable, fungible. but real leaders. Okay, conquer, conquer, conqueror, YT, whatever. Okay, asks, what's the primary force which drives history? Is it geography? Is it economics? Is it warfare? Is it culture? Is it willpower? Is it emotions? Is it great? Is it great men? And so on. So, what is the primary force that drives history? Well, there are numerous forces that drive history. One of the things that is should be obvious. I mean, I'm sure nothing is obvious, but one of the main drivers of history is human nature. You will see that history repeats itself. It's cyclical. It happens in cycles. In China, they call that the dynastic cycles. A dynasty emerges and becomes powerful and rules for a long period of time, and then eventually it loses the mandate of heaven, which means it loses control of the nation, and then it falls, and then there's an extended period of chaos, maybe a few decades, maybe a century or so. Then a new dynasty emerges, and the same thing happens over and over and over again. Similarly, you see the rise and fall of kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, even the rise and fall of civilizations, and so on. So, why do we see these things happen in cycles? It's because human nature is non changing, it is everlasting. The same needs, desires, wants, aspirations, ambitions that we have today, the same were in play 5,000 years ago. And the same cycles of history were occurring even then, but we had different technology. So it happened at a different pace, and at a different scale. Today, it can happen on a global scale, the same things. So, one of the forces that drives history is human nature, human psychology. The other force that drives history is conquest. Conquest. Okay? Civilization doesn't matter. Civilization can fall. You may be the most sophisticated civilization, but a ragtag bunch of tribals can come and destroy you if they have better tactics and they're focused only on one objective, which is warfare. So I think it's human nature, and it is conquest. Obviously, geography plays a factor in all these things. Economics plays a factor. Culture. Yeah, okay. Some people are more warlike because they have more primitive cultures, or more warlike cultures. People uh, peoples who emerge from regions that have scarcity typically are hardier, and they are more focused on warfare because they have to scrounge around for a living, and there's so little resources that you have to fight each other constantly for whatever little resources exist. So if a leader can bring everybody together, then they can go with that same lifestyle, they can conquer other nations much easier, even though those nations may be culturally, civilizationally way superior to this ragtag bunch of tribals and so on. So, and obviously, there is the great man theory, which means that all historical changes, geopolitical changes, are driven by the actions of great men, which could have more than a small grain of truth in them. So, it is conquest, it is human nature, and maybe it is the actions of a few great men in history. Can I think of any great women who have changed the course of history in a certain region? Maybe in some cases there may be. Um, okay, but yeah, we call it the great man theory. And there's also the violent ape theory, which means that we, at the core, are just violent apes. Look at our closest cousins, the chimpanzees. They behave just like us. They have gang warfare, they have warlords, they have territorial disputes, they have senseless violence, brutality. They are very much like us, the chimpanzees. We have certain more levels of sophistication. Some of us belong to cultures that are rather civilized. India, Bharatvarsh, has been a great civilization for the past 10,000 years. But at the end of the day, it's conquest, it's violence, and human nature that is the driving force of history. And conquest has, well, why do we conquer? Well, if you ask some people, why do you conquer? They'll say, I conquer because I can. But it's about ambition, it's about greed, it's about the want to control more, you want more resources, and so on and so forth, etc. Okay, Imran Naimi says, why are the names of the languages different in Turkic speaking countries, but they all use almost the same grammar and words? They can all communicate with each other, such as Turkey, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tatarstan, etc. Why are the names of the languages in these countries not called Turki or Turkish? Why do they have different names? For example, in England, the US, Australia, they call their language English. Otherwise, they are geographically very far apart, and they have their own accents and unique words as well. Also, uh, Persian-speaking countries such as Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan have different language names too. What's the reason? Okay, so good question, interesting question. So there are nations that are Persian speaking nations. Persia, obviously, Iran, uh, Tajikistan, they speak Persian there. Parts of Afghanistan, they speak Persian there. Most Afghans speak Pashto, the actual native language of Afghanistan. But Dari is also an official language, state language in Afghanistan. And that is the Afghan version of Persian, which is Persian itself. Tajikistan also, they speak their own variant of Persian, and in Iran, they speak Persian. But so why is Persian called Dari in Afghanistan? And why that? And when it comes to the Turkic nations, in Turkey, they speak the Turkish language. In Azerbaijan, they speak Azeri. In Uzbekistan, they speak Uzbek. In Turkmenistan, they speak Turkmen. In Kyrgyzstan, they speak the Kyrgyz language. In Kazakhstan, they speak the Kazakh language. Tatarstan, which is part of China right now, they speak the Tatar language. But these languages are mutually more or less intelligible. So you can communicate with each other despite speaking apparently different languages. Why is that? Because all these Turkic languages are part of the Turkic language family. In India, especially in northern and western India, it doesn't matter whether your mother tongue is this or that. You can kind of understand each other. If you are a Bengali speaking person and you communicate to a Hindi speaking person in Bengali, and that person answers back in Hindi, you can more or less understand each other. If you are a Marathi speaking person and you speak to somebody whose native language is Gujarati, you can speak to each other in your own language and you can kind of understand each other. That's the kind of thing it is. So the languages are very closely connected and related. The Turkic languages. There have been other languages, Turkic languages like Chagatai, etc., that no longer exist. And so the languages have evolved over time. The Turkic peoples, they spread all across Central Asia in very, very distant, disparate parts of Central Asia, geographically significantly distant, separated from each other. And that's why there was less communication for centuries. And that's how languages evolved and diverged to certain degrees from each other and acquired different names. But they are all Turkic languages, which is why they are mutually intelligible. Similarly, Persian, well, because of history. See, the Persian language has evolved over time. About 3,000 years ago, it was very much similar to Sanskrit. It was a daughter language of Sanskrit. And there is ample evidence of that. Read the Behistun Bhagasthana inscription and so on. And then the language evolved over time, Persian. And it has been more or less standardized, the Persian language, in the past roughly 1,000 years because of the incredible influence of the Shahnameh of Firdausi. And Firdausi, well, let's not talk about Firdausi and his opinions about various matters, but yeah. So Firdausi, the Shahnameh of Firdausi, has been an extremely influential text in standardizing the Persian language, which is why the Persian language hasn't changed much in the past 1,000 years, roughly 1,000 years, roughly. And it's spoken in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and because it's been such a long time, the languages have slightly been altered, and they have taken different names. So in Afghanistan, they call it Dari, which is nothing but Persian. When it comes to English, well, the English phenomenon is very recent. The English conquered much of the world in the past like 300 or so years. So it's a very new phenomenon. It's not a very ancient language. What's the origin of the English, modern English language? It's a Germanic language. Okay, it's not a Brittonic language. The Brittonic peoples were Celtic peoples. The English were Germanic. The Angles and the Saxons came from Germany. They were a Germanic people. They conquered the British Isles and they smashed everything in existence and enslaved and destroyed the Celts. And then the Angles and Saxons became the Saxons. They had their little kingdoms on the British Islands, primitive little kingdoms like Northumbria and Mercia and East Anglia and whatever. Then there was a Viking age from about 880 to about 1050 AD, roughly 250 years. when great Vikings came and had their fun in England. And then you had a descendant of one of these Vikings. His name was William Guillaume le Bâtard. He was a Norman. So he was called William the Bastard, but he conquered England at the age of 50 something, and then he was called William the Conqueror. And then England fell out of so then the Normans, who were descendants of Vikings, intermingled with the French. They took over England, and the Saxons lost all sovereignty of England. So for a time you had the Saxon language that was prevalent. So initially it was the Pictish and various Celtic languages, Gaelic, etc., Irish, Old Irish, etc., that were the major languages in England, in the British Isles. Then you had Saxon, the Saxon language, for a few centuries. The Angles and Saxons conquered the British Islands in the what, about 4th, 5th centuries AD, roughly. Okay, you can maybe off by a century or so, but you can look it up. Then in the year 1066, the Normans take over. So the Saxon language becomes marginalized, and the Norman language becomes the lingua franca in England. And the Norman language, you could say it was French. Okay, it was more or less French. So for a few centuries, the nobility, the aristocracy of England, the nobles, they speak French, and the peasants, they speak Saxon. And then eventually these languages combine, and the modern English language eventually emerges out of all this. So English today is a Germanic language. It's a reasonably recent language. And these nations, the England, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, well, they all speak this very recent language. So these are cultures with very little time that they've existed, and that's why it is like that. When it comes to the Turkic languages, the various nations that speak Persian, and the various Indo-Aryan languages, these are extremely ancient. The Turkic languages would have been around for about 2000 plus years. The originators, the progenitors of the Turks are the ancient Xiongnu, who emerged from the region of Mongolia today. And they were the Huns, and they were you could say, the parent ethnic group of the Mongolians as well as the Turks. So the Turkic languages, you could say, are descendants of the old Hunnic language, which existed about 2,500 years ago. So that's how ancient the Turkic language family is, roughly. The Persian language family goes back to at least 1,000, 1,500 BC, which is 3,500 years before that, before which it was part of the Indian language family. And the Indian language family goes back, let's say, 10,000 years at least. So that's how you have all that. Okay, Rudrajit Sarkar says Namibia and South Africa once used to be a single country. Then how did the country break up? What roles did the two superpowers and their allies play in this issue? Let's go to the map. Where is the Namibia? Yes. So we go to Africa, and you go to the southern part of Africa, and there you have South Africa, Lesotho, Maseru, and you have Namibia. So what is the deal about Namibia? So what's the origin of this nation called Namibia? So it originates in the 1870s or 1880s when the Germans took control of this part of Africa, which is roughly today's Namibia. Maybe some parts of Botswana may also have been part of that. So the Germans colonized this region, and it is rich in certain kinds of resources. Okay, homework, look it up. What resources are prevalent, are abundant in Namibia? Very interesting resources, okay, by the way, Namibia. Very interesting, very lucrative. So the Germans were in control of this territory from the roughly 1880s until, let's say, 1918, 1919, end of the First World War, which Germany lost. So Germany loses the First World War, and then this land, let's say nation, Namibia, begins to be administered from South Africa, but it is technically still a separate nation. So the two nations were never a single country; they were technically always separate countries. Now, South Africa has an interesting history itself. Obviously, originally African. Then the Dutch entered this region, and the Dutch had created two nations in South Africa, two territories in South Africa. One was Orange Free Country or Transvaal, and the other was what? There was another one which I can't remember right now. Okay, these were the Afrikaner people, and eventually the British took over this region, and there were two Boer wars. One was in the 1880s, if my memory serves me right. Please look it up and fact check me. I may be off by a decade or so. Roughly 1880s, the first Boer War. The Boers were Dutch origin Afrikaner people. They fought the British for their independence. So the first Boer War was in the 1880s. The second Boer War was in the early 20th century, 1902 or something. And Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Mohandas Gandhi, wanted India to fight on behalf of the British against the Dutch. And the British rejected his request because the British were obviously not willing to give weapons in the arms of Indians. Because then, well, there could it could lead to other problems. So Mr. Gandhi's request was denied, and he had to be content with driving ambulances and helping the British, serving the British in other ways against the Boers. And the Boers were defeated in the Second Boer War, and they were maltreated horribly. The British created concentration camps for the Boers, and they starved little children to death in that. Wonderful people, the British. And South Africa came under British rule entirely. And Mr. Gandhi, he was dispatched to India roughly 1915 or so by the British to serve a different purpose there. Anyway, we're talking about Namibia. So after the end of the First World War, Namibia, when Germany lost, Namibia came under the control of South Africa. It was administered from South Africa, and obviously it was exploited. The people had no agency, they had no freedom, there was no democracy, there were no human rights. It was the same system, maybe even harsher system than what you had in South Africa. In South Africa, you had the apartheid system. We know that very well, right? Hopefully, I hope. I don't know what you're taught in education, in the Indian education system, but there was the system of apartheid in South Africa. And now the question, so that is how it was. Now the question is, what was the role of the two superpowers? So the Soviets were backing this nation north of Namibia called Angola. There was a long civil war there, which was a proxy war. But the Americans did not want Soviet influence in this region, so they armed various proxy groups to fight the Soviets and the government of Angola, and then you had a long civil war in Angola. The Soviets supported freedom for Namibia. Namibia was under South African administration, occupation, whatever you want to call it. It was under a brutal apartheid regime, and they had a freedom movement called People's Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, and their leader in the later part of the history was a guy called Sam Nujoma, who eventually became the first president of Namibia. So the Soviets were in favor of the independence of Namibia. The Americans supported South Africa's brutal apartheid regime, which was brutally crushing all attempts to fight for freedom in Namibia. So the Americans, as they often are, or they often were on the wrong side of history. They supported the brutal South African apartheid regime. Then in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and the USSR begins to disintegrate. And then there's no more USSR influence in Africa. And then the Americans, they change tactics and they start the negotiations in South Africa for the end of apartheid. And they also ensure that Namibia is given its independence, I think in 1990 or something. Look it up. Look it up if you're interested. And Mr. Sam Nujoma becomes the first president or leader, prime minister, president, whatever it was, of Namibia. That is the deal. So Namibia and South Africa were always two separate countries technically, even though Namibia was ruled by South Africa. And it all ends in 1990, when roughly 1990, plus or minus 1 or 2 years. Look it up. When Namibia is granted, offered independence on South African terms. And that is the deal. Interesting history. Namibia has very interesting resources. Okay, Asha Kashyap says, what was witch burning? How and when did it begin? Why is it not spoken about much? Well, there are certain interests that would not like you to know about this, and that would not like people to speak about this. Certain interests, certain vested interests in the world. Now, ask yourself, who rules the world? It's the Western nations that rule the world, right? It is the West that actually rules the world. The so-called rules-based global order. Who's the super cop that runs that? It's the US. The US is an outshoot of the British. It is a continuation of the British Empire. The British are Europeans, Western Europeans. And we know the religious angle in that, Christianity. So all of that comes together to ensure that we don't speak out which burning too much, because that makes Europeans and Christians look bad. Nowadays, they are like Christianity needs to go, and some other religions need to be brought in. That's okay. That's their interests keep changing. But historically, it's been like this. So now the question is, what is witch burning? What was witch burning? So we have to look back at the proper context of history. Europe used to once, it had a different culture once. Europe, the whole of Europe, the old Indo-European culture, which was an offshoot of the old, even more ancient Vedic culture. Same gods, same practices, and so on. Women had a exalted status in society in the old Indo-European culture. It was a polytheistic culture and no monotheism and so on. So that is how Europe used to be. In the last of the great European polytheists, where you could say the Vikings and the Slavs, in the Slavic regions, polytheism persisted until what, the 16th, 17th, even 18th century, perhaps even 19th century. Even now, there are pagan movements in the Slavic world, even in the Teutonic world nowadays, Asatru and all that. Now, going back to the origin. So Europe once had a polytheistic culture, just like India's culture. Probably it was an offshoot of the Indian culture, old Indian culture going back 10,000 years. Now, when at the end of the Viking Age, around the year 1050, roughly in the 11th century, Christianity became a major force in Europe. So Christianity had been the official religion of the Roman Empire centuries before that, dating back to the rule of Constantine, who ruled from Byzantion, which is Constantinople, currently part of Turkey for now. Uh, but Christianity had not spread across Europe until the 11th or so centuries. It had spread to parts of Europe, but not all over Europe. So then there were, you must have heard about the Crusades. Richard the Lionheart and his friends and his allies, European allies, Western European allies, they go and invade the region of Israel, that region, Lebanon, Israel, etc. And they want to liberate Jerusalem from the so-called Saracens. And one of the great leaders of the Saracens was Salahuddin, and he dealt them a significant blow in the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. Look that up. Interesting story there. We'll not go there right now. But yes, so you had the Crusades. You must have heard of the Crusades. But there were Northern Crusades also, in which Europeans were attacked and their lifestyles, livelihoods destroyed, and their indigenous culture and religion smashed out of existence brutally, through bloody means. And Northern Europe, etc., became Christianized as a consequence of these repeated so-called Northern Crusades. So Europeans attacking Europeans, Europeans destroying European culture just to spread Christianity. And eventually the whole of Europe became Christian. But it is not easy to stamp out traditional, uh, you know, long existing culture. For example, in India, the people of Goa were forcibly converted to Christianity, but they were practicing Hinduism in secret. And then, because of that, the Portuguese brought in the Inquisition. That fellow, what's his name? I forget the name. His name starts with X, F or X or something. I forget the guy's name. That individual. He brought in the Inquisition in Goa, even though he may not have been Portuguese, but doesn't matter. That fellow. Somehow the name slips out of my mind. So the Europeans, the Christians, did the same thing in Europe. They brought in the Inquisition to stamp out any remnants of pagan culture. And one of the things about the old Indo-European culture was that you had gender roles and what they would today call toxic masculinity. So genders had roles. Men did the hard work, the heavy lifting, the field work, the fighting if you were a soldier, the field work if you were a farmer, the hammering if you were a metalsmith, and so on. And women took care of the house and took care of healthcare and all that. Gender roles, how horrible and primitive the world used to be. Just imagine that. Imagine that. So women were in charge of healing. They had ancient knowledge of herbs. In India, what do we call that? We call it Ayurveda. So the women folk of Europe traditionally were in charge of healing, and they had that superpower. They had the knowledge, ancient knowledge that gave them the power of life or death over people. And obviously, it was used for good mostly, hopefully, I guess, to heal people. Now, that was a major impediment in the path of the church. The church despised women. I mean, look, it's not a controversial thing I'm saying over here. Look at the history of the church, the Vatican. How many female popes have you had? How many female cardinals have you had in the past 2000 whatever years? Okay, so let's not even call that statement controversial. Not even try. So the church despised women. They saw them, they wanted women to have second class status in society. And historically, women were healers, they were revered. So the church said any woman who has any such knowledge is to be declared an agent of Satan. She consorts with the devil, with Lucifer himself. And then this book became popular, the Maleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, which was a manual that taught you, that gave you detailed instructions in as to in how to identify witches and how to punish them. Various forms of joint manipulation and various tactics and methods to loosen people's tongues, essentially torture, and how to kill them through brutal ways, and how to identify the signs and symptoms of a person being a witch. And even men were used to be accused of being witches. And this began the craze of witch killing, witch burning in Europe. And hundreds of thousands of women were innocent women were burned alive or drowned or pressed. If you don't know what pressing is, look it up. So they were either burned. Most of them were burned. Some were drowned. Drowning was a test, and some were pressed, etc. And this was a reign of terror. And for a couple of centuries at least, the second most popular book in Europe was the Maleus Maleficarum. It was written by a couple of Christian priests. So that's what witch burning was. These days, thankfully, it's not there. That was the dark history of Europe, and it even made its reared its ugly head in North America. Read about the Salem witch trials. Okay. And why is it not mentioned much? Because it is an inconvenient fact. They would like to accuse us of being primitive. We were the ones who burned our women folk alive, sati pratha. And lots and millions of Indians, innocent Indians, this has been put into their heads that our ancestors were barbarians, misogynic barbarians. And once a woman became a widow, she would be burned alive. That's what lots of Indians think today. They've been taught this because your education system is designed to make you believe these lies. So that's what witch burning was, and that's why they would not like to speak about that. They would like to rather speak about fictitious, artificially created atrocity narratives like sati and whatnot in India. So yeah, Rodrajit Sarkar again says, was Hawaii uninhabited before the European colonization of the island? If not, then did the native Hawaiians suffer the same fates as the Native Americans? Good question. First of all, let's see where Hawaii is. So we go eastwards into the Pacific Ocean. And in the middle of the Pacific, North Pacific, we have these islands. Somewhere in between Eastern Asia and the west coast of the Americas. And these are the Hawaiian Islands. It's an archipelago, a cluster of islands. Okay, so you have the Hawaiian Islands here, and these islands were not uninhabited before the Europeans arrived. So some of you may be aware of Hawaii. It's a very famous, very popular tourist destination. Very nice climate and surfing and beaches and whatever else, and apparently exotic culture and all that. And it's one of the it's one of the states of the United States. The US has 50 states. Hawaii is one of those. So the Americans annexed Hawaii sometime in the late 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, you can look up the exact date when it happened, but the Americans annexed Hawaii by force. Forcible annexation. So when Mr. Putin wants to take over parts of Ukraine, it's very naughty, it's very bad, it's very evil, it's very brutal, it's very dictatorial. But when the US annexes Hawaii by force, it's perfectly democratic and natural. When the US takes over large chunks of Mexico by force, it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly nice because the US does it. So it's fine. So the Hawaiians were a Polynesian people, and they have been present in Hawaii for at least 1700 years, maybe 2000 years, maybe more. And so, like I said, they are Polynesian people related to the various Pacific island people in French Polynesia, Tonga, the Cook Islands, Solomon Islands, etc., 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 the South Pacific Islands, and so on, Hangaroa and Hawaii. So they are Polynesian people. So what happened once the Europeans started colonizing Hawaii? First of all, most of the land of the Hawaiian people was taken over by the Europeans, who established plantations and whatnot over there. Secondly, um, more than 90% of the native population died out, was killed off or died out. You can see it whichever way you like. The nice way of looking at it is that maybe the Europeans brought in illnesses that these native people had never been exposed to, and so s- you know illnesses like influenza and smallpox, etc., killed off lots of these people. Whatever happened, the fact is that more than 90% of the natives were they died out. Some of them were killed off, some of them died of illness, whatever. More than 90%. That is very much the G word, isn't it? Genocide. A similar thing happened in North America, in South America. In North America, the British and the French killed off most of the natives and completely marginalized the rest. Today, if you go to Canada, if you go to the US, these unfortunate natives of the land are forced to live in reservations, which are like the worst territory with no real amenities. And well, they are called Indians, and they are treated like second class or third class citizens. In Canada, you have starlight tours. I'm not sure if they still happen, but Google starlight tours. Horrific practices that the Canadian police had. And the other way of marginalizing the natives in North America and South America is by destroying their ethnic, racial, let's say, purity. How dare I speak of ethnic purity, racial purity, huh? So, and religion, of course. So today, most natives in North America would be Christians. I don't know if their native culture, religion even exists anymore. And most of them are no longer even pure native. They are all mixed with the invaders, occupiers of the territory. A similar thing has happened in Hawaii. Their language has been wiped out. Everyone speaks English now. There must be very few people in Hawaii who actually speak the original native language of Hawaii. Their indigenous culture has been exoticized. The hula dance is acceptable, but no other form of native culture is acceptable except what is allowed. The native religion no longer exists. Everybody has been converted to Christianity, and lots of the people have been have intermixed with the invaders and occupiers, settler colonialists of the land. So it has been a demic and cultural genocide. So yes, you are right. The native Hawaiians have essentially suffered the same fate as the Native Americans in North and South America. But but the West is still the arbiter of human rights and democracy. They still are the supreme authority on human rights and democracy. Doesn't matter what they've done and are still doing. That's okay if they do it. Nausia says, why is it so that our education system has never bothered to teach us about the Mongol history or the Chinese history? It is one thing to not teach Indian history, but why is it that these other histories of the world were completely sidelined, not mentioned? Was there any agenda behind this to again make us unaware of what happened in the world and in our own country? When I was a kid, India was a very different country. The closest country that exists today, I would say, is North Korea. In the 1980s and the 1990s, India was so different. It was an insular country, an inward looking country. You had one television channel across the country, and you would have news every day. And 80% of the news would be so and so minister said so and so thing in so and so speech. So and so minister said something else in some other speech. The prime minister inaugurated so and so project. He went and cut the ribbon here. And so minister did this, and so on. What ministers have said today, that was news. And you would get next to no information about what was happening outside of India. Nothing. So Indians in the 1980s and 1990s, up till that time, did not, until the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, India started opening up. So until the 1980s, Indians had no idea of what was outside India. They had never seen a foreign person. India was completely insular, just like North Korea. The people were not allowed to know what was happening outside the country. That's what India was like. So are you surprised the education system is also like that? Why are you surprised? They wanted the rulers of India, the post 1947 rulers of India wanted Indians to be completely cut off from the rest of the world. They did not want to see India prosper and grow. It was a captive population, like a population of sheep. A shepherd will take care of his population, but he will keep it insulated, isolated from the rest of the world. And the sheep are eventually for slaughter, right? So there was no economic growth, nothing. It was all rent seeking. Much of that still exists in some forms. There is obviously progress now. So that's how India was. And the most dangerous thing in a captive population is that you understand how the world works. That is dangerous if you really understand how the world works. So you should not understand how the world works. And how are you to be made to not understand how the world works? By giving you no information about the world and telling you lies about the world. So when it comes to your own history, my friends, they have been lying to you for decades. Everything, most of what you are being taught today is sprinkled with lies and distortions. 80% truth, 20% lies, lots of omissions, lots of censorships, lots of distortion. That's about your own history. Second, they will not teach you your culture at all. This is the only nation, only civilization in the world where kids are not taught their own culture. So generation upon generation, we're becoming more and more deracinated. The 15-year-olds of today, what connection do they have to their ancestral culture? Nothing whatsoever. So in a few decades, India is going to be, will maybe not even be a Hindu country. Of course, we are officially a secular country, right? So it's a project to destroy India's culture. And when it comes to world history, you should not be taught world history, because then you will understand more how the world really works. So all they will teach you is British history and the wonderful things, the great favors the British did to India. That's all they will teach you. They won't teach you Chinese history, Mongol history, Central Asian history, European history. They'll teach you none of that. Especially the history of if you understand history, if you're taught history properly, you will start to understand cause and effect. That is what they don't want you to understand. They don't want you to understand causality, because then you can see through their actions. Because the same forces, the same agendas that have shaped world history in the past are today shaping geopolitics and internal politics, local politics. So that is the agenda, and that is still at play. Your textbooks are still distorted. Your textbooks still have enormous omissions of your own history and world history. And the way they teach history and they teach science and mathematics or anything it hurts my brain physically when I see these textbooks. These people who formulate these textbooks, I wonder what IQ they have. Or maybe they are very intelligent, but they have a nefarious agenda. So there is a crying need to reform the education system. But it's not happening. And these 5 years, it's not going to happen. So, yeah, I've kind of given up hope on that. Now, Sia says, what do you think was the basis on which Indians were divided into among many castes? 4 castes. 4, not many castes, 4, by the British to divide and rule. And how can we as Indians solve this problem? The problem is that it is not in our hands anymore. See, India has never had 4 castes. India has had the Varna and Jati system, which is a system of classification and division of labor. India is a 10,000-year-old plus society. Obviously, there's going to be division of labor and social classification and all that. It happens in any functioning society. So we had tremendous numbers or tremendous quantities of Varnas and Jatis. I mean, four Varnas and tremendous quantity of Jatis. And the British could not understand this. They could not wrap their puny little minds around that. So they oversimplified everything by creating four castes and force fitting people into these four castes. That what is they have done, and today we are taught that it is a social evil that is the legacy of our ancestors. Now, what can we as Indians do today to solve the problem? We can do nothing. The government has to solve this problem, but the government well, the system benefits the politicians who are in power today. So why will they solve this? Why will they change anything? Think about it. The politicians who are in power today, they came to power through the system. So why will they change the system? Why? The system has benefited them. That's why they're in power today. Why will they change it? So I don't see it being solved. But what would you do to solve the problem? So you can only solve the problem if you are in power in the government. You as common people can do nothing about it. It's very simple to solve this. First of all, delete all references to caste in your government and education certificates and birth certificates. Why do you need to mention caste? If caste is not important, then delete all references to caste from your birth certificate, from your government documents, and from your educational documents. Delete everything. End of story. There's no official caste anymore. That's number one. Secondly, give reservations if necessary on the basis of economic status, not caste. These two things will immediately end the problem, but no politician will have the, let's say, the guts to do that. No politician will do that because it may be political suicide. But somebody has to take the bull by the horns. Who is that leader going to be? That is going to be the next great leader of the country. Right now, we have no great leaders or great enough leaders. This is a gigantic problem that needs to be solved. And the solution is straightforward but difficult. It will take a leader of exceptional fortitude to do this. And right now, we don't have such leaders. Okay. Rodrajit Sarkar asks a question. The question is, did ancient Indians have any common language that could connect the whole subcontinent? Really, sir? Or did they have so many regional languages as we have now? We've always had regional languages. A subcontinent-sized nation, enormous, gigantic nation. Indians, we see this map of India and we think it's a small nation. It's an enormous nation, India. And historical India was even larger than that. Our border, northwestern border, was the border with Turkmenistan. Sorry, Tajikistan. In the 12th century, India's northwestern border was the border between today's border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Okay, so historically, India was even larger than what it is today. So obviously, you will have lots of local languages, just like today. But we always had one common language that unified the subcontinent civilizationally. It's the world's oldest known language. It's Sanskrit. That was our civilizational language. And it was spoken in all civilized parts of the world in the old days before the Turks and the Europeans destroyed India. So even today in Indonesia, they still have Sanskrit names, Megawati Sukarnoputri. And they have mixed names also. So the strangest names you will see, what? Mohammed, Vishnu, that sort of name you'll see over there. But anyway, the point is, we always had that civilizational language, Sanskrit. And the fact that we don't have a civilizational language today indicates that we have given up the status of civilization. Today's India is not a civilization. Today's India is a mere nation state. So those politicians who like to tom that we are the world's oldest civilization, if you want India to be the world's oldest civilization, to still have that status, you need to bring back Sanskrit. Slogans will change nothing. Slogans will do nothing. They won't even get you elected, these slogans, unless you do some action. So, yeah. So, Sanskrit was a language. Malik Syed says, it's a hard fact. We know that an average Indian is not disciplined and polite on the ground level, resulting in poor waste management and other things. My question is it not, was it not the same case in China 2 decades ago? How did they change from this? And how did they teach their people discipline? And how can we do that in India? That is an excellent question. Look, first of all, every nation has a set of standards. And what standards are these? You see, the standards of a nation are generally set by the top 0.1% of the population. Top is in the highest achieving people, the people who really make the nation work. You know what Mustafa Kemal Atatürk used to say? He didn't say this, but he had the greatest he had a great belief, Ataturk, in the greatness of his nation Turkey, but he despised the average ordinary Turkish person. He had a very low regard for the average Turk, but he had the highest belief in the nation. And you will say it doesn't make any sense. It makes sense. It is the top 0.1% of people who actually run a country and who set the standards for the whole country to follow. And the greatness of a country depends on the greatness of that 0.1% of the population. So, those of you who want to really make a difference, you need to strive to be among the 0.1% of the population, the genuine movers and achievers of a nation. So, that's first of all, number one. So, the average person is going to have low standards. You go to any nation, the average person will have lower standards than perhaps the standards of the best in the nation. Now, secondly, you are right. Most Indians are indisciplined. They will litter on the streets. Some of them will spit on the streets. They are not well behaved, impolite, etc. And all that. Yes. But isn't it curious that the same Indians, the moment they go to a first world country, their entire behavior and attitude changes. And they are generally the most low abiding demographic in the West, Indians, and the highest achieving demographic in the West on average. Why is it so? So, does it mean that the average Indian is to blame for the situation? That is not the case. When Singapore became an independent nation, it had abysmal standards. It was a third world country. People had this, they had the same attitudes as people in small towns in India today. So how did Singapore become a first world country in just one generation, 20 years? Through iron discipline and enforcement of that discipline through harsh means. Singapore's leader was a benevolent dictator, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and he imposed a harsh regime of discipline in Singapore. Heavy back-breaking fines for a simple thing like spitting on the street or not flushing a toilet seat or not flushing a toilet. Extremely harsh punishments for the smallest of infractions. And over a few years, everybody straightened out. Everybody became people with high standards. So that's how you do it. You do it by enforcing, first of all, setting down the rules of behavior and then enforcing those rules of behaviors rigidly and meting out harsh punishments, but not horrible punishments, harsh punishments to those who break the rules. You need to have enforcement. That's how very quickly people will change their behavior. It's about incentives and disincentives. That's it. Human psychology, basic Pavlovian psychology almost. And the Chinese, they have been trying to emulate Singapore. Now, I think Deng Xiaoping said that if I was running just one city, Shanghai, then I could replicate what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore. But unfortunately, he was ruling a nation of 1.3 billion people at the time. So it's taking time, obviously. But the Chinese have also tried to replicate the Singapore model. and they obviously have very strict discipline, very harsh punishments, and all that. So it's working there also. So my point is, you don't need to abuse human rights in terms of the harshness of your punishments, but you need to have consistent, predictable punishments if somebody breaks the law. So if you break the law, you should be certain that I'm going to be punished now. And if the certainty of punishment is there, then you will not break the law. And that's how you make people behave. And very quickly, people adapt and they all become law abiding people, and they all become people with the highest civic sense. That's what needs to happen. So the law standards emanate from the government of India. I'm not talking about the government at the top in Delhi. I'm talking about your local municipalities and district corporations and all that. These are the people, these are the administrations that should be enforcing these rules and raising the standards. But they don't do that. I'm sure there are places in India where actually we have very high standards, maybe higher than Singapore. I'm sure there are places like that. So I'm not saying all municipal corporations and all district administrations are like that. Some of them may be better than New York, I'm sure, but many of them have rather low standards. That's what I mean. Rodrajit Sarkar says, did ancient India establish any intercontinental trade routes like the Silk Road? Which land and sea routes did ancient Indians use to trade with other countries? Okay, let's go to the map. Of course, you had these things. So India used to trade 2000 years ago. Okay, let's go back older than that. 3000, 4000, 5000 years ago, India was trading with Mesopotamia. Uh, and we know that because we have Indus, Saraswati Sindhu era Indian ports and settlements in Oman, in eastern Iran, etc. We have found Saraswati Sindhu seals in the Mesopotamia region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So there is ample evidence that India was trading with Mesopotamia 4,000-5,000 years before today. So the trade route was via the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz over here. Then India was trading with Egypt about 4,000 years ago at least. And we have evidence of that as well. So that's 4,000 years ago. Then we know that India was trading with Rome 2,000 years ago. They have found statues of Indian ivory carved gods and goddesses in, I believe, Pompeii or Herculaneum and other parts of Italy. They have found Indian coins in various parts of Italy, which was ruled by Rome. And they found lots and lots of Roman coins, etc., in various parts of India, in temples, in other archaeological sites. They found Roman amphoras, etc., 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 in India. So India was trading with Rome 2000 or so years ago. That is a whole long trade route. And Indians have settled in Eastern Africa for centuries, if not thousands of years. The eastern part of Africa is deeply, deeply influenced by Indian culture in ways that are still visible today in the cuisine, in the kind of clothing that they wear, and even in the genetics of their cattle and all that. And obviously, India has been trading with Eastern Asia for centuries, for about 3,000 years. The people of Kalinga have been trading with Suvarnabhumi, which is Thailand and Southeast Asia, for about 3,000 years. They used to cross the ocean in ships. And Vasco da Gama, when he reached the Cape of Good Hope and he wanted to find a way to India, he met Indians in Eastern Africa, and that's how he was able to come to India with their help. And he thought that he had the world's biggest ship, but then he saw an Indian ship which was about 3 times the size of his ship. So that's how good Indian ships were. So that is, in brief, the kind of international intercontinental trade routes that India had, and I'm sure we had other trade routes that we may not even be aware of today. Okay, Why Mao says two questions. Unlike Southeast Asia, why couldn't Hinduism culturally influence or gain followers in Central Asia and Western Asia? What are the reasons behind this? Secondly, why don't we find any Indian cultural or religious presence in Central Asia? I'm not talking about the Buddhist influence. Is there any Hindu presence that predates the Buddhist influence? Okay, Central Asia. What is Central Asia? Yes, let's take a look at the map. Okay, we are in the Indian Ocean region. Let's go northwards. So Central Asia is essentially present-day Xinjiang, the Tarim Basin River, all the way up to, let's say, the Caucasus region and the Central Asian steppe, which is Kazakhstan, etc., all the way up to eastern Ukraine. That is what you could say is Central Asia. Okay, that's the region that Weimar is referring to. Now, what's the deal? Here's the deal. There were Indianized kingdoms all across Central Asia for thousands of years before Buddhism was even born. What's the beginning of Buddhism? The birth of Gautam Buddha, right? His lifetime, which is about 2.5, roughly 1,000 years before today. Um, so before that, there was no Buddhism. There was only Hinduism and Jainism. So, so the latest Tirthankar is Bhagwan Mahavir, who was kind of a contemporary of the Buddha. And there were Tirthankars before him also, it is said, and there are Buddhas before Buddha also. But as far as we are concerned, we can say that that Buddhism began with the birth of Buddha or his lifetime about 2,500 years before today. Before that, there was no Buddhism, there was only Hinduism, various forms of Hinduism, various schools of thoughts and all that. So these old Indianized kingdoms in Central Asia, dating back thousands of years, were all Hindu kingdoms. Or at least initially, originally, the people who migrated there were Hindus. And then over centuries, they may have diverged in their lifestyles, and eventually Indians called them mlechas, which means that they no longer follow the Vedic customs properly. Maybe they only semi follow the Vedic customs, or maybe they abandoned entirely. So you had a Hindu influence all across Central Asia. Then what happened is the question. Why do we see nothing of that today? Well, if you go to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, you will see almost no Buddhist relics also over there. Maybe one or two ruined stupas here or there. Maybe in Turkmenistan something is there. A little bit here and there, but not much. Afghanistan, Gandhar was part of India until 800 years ago. So that you will find over there. But Turkmenistan, you may see one or two archaeological sites and not much more beyond that. What happened to all the... Let's talk about the Buddhist stupas. Where are those? Where have they gone? And before the Buddhist stupas, you would have had Hindu temples. Where did those go? I mean, is it so hard to answer? So first of all, let me go to the map again. Let's talk about something less controversial to start off with. Armenia. So today, if you go to Azerbaijan, okay, to Baku, there is a fire temple there, which is used by Hindus as well as Zoroastrians, because Zoroastrianism came from Hinduism. So very similar religions, you can say. So that fire temple is used by Zoroastrians as well as Hindus in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, Armenia historically was much larger, and Azerbaijan did not even exist at a point in time. So Armenia is said to be the world's first Christian nation, and one of their kings, about 2,000 or so years ago, mandated that everybody has to convert to Christianity. Before Armenia became a Christian nation, it was a Zoroastrian and Hindu nation. Okay, Armenia. Today, the Turks, you know what they call the Armenians? They call them Indians. So Armenia used to be a Zoroastrian and Hindu nation, and there were Hindu temples in Armenia. And about 2,000 years ago, these temples were destroyed. Hindu temples were destroyed, and churches were built on top of them, of these Hindu temples. And about a century or so ago, those churches were destroyed and mosques were built on top of them. So now that you see the pattern, is it so hard to understand where all the Hindu and Buddhist relics went in Central Asia? That's how it typically goes. So everything was destroyed, and new religious structures, Abrahamic religious structures, came up on top of them. That's what happened. That's why you will see no Hindu temples and almost no Buddhist temples, stupas, etc. in Central Asia. And one of the things that Chinggis Khan did, the great Mongol conqueror Chinggis Khan, when he conquered Khwarezm, which is in Central Asia and also Iran, he destroyed some of these mosques and built Buddhist temples on top of them. So he knew what had been going on there. So that's what happened. So you had Hindu influence. Actually, at a point in time, the whole of Central Asia was Hindu. Later, there was Zoroastrian influence. Later, there was Buddhist influence. And eventually, there was Islamic influence, going back about 1,000 years only before today. So until 1,000 years ago, it was all Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian. Today, you will see no evidence, almost no evidence of the old culture. That's how thoroughly everything has been wiped out. Amit Kumar says India had great scientists and mathematicians and the renowned Nalanda University. Given our historical achievements and the military might we had in terms of size at the time, why didn't we develop advanced military technology to gain an edge over Islamic invaders, especially considering the references to powerful weapons like the Brahmastra in our history? Okay, forget about the Brahmastra. We had a great culture, great civilization, great universities, lot of mathematics, tremendous architecture, geometry, calculus, infinite series, astronomy, everything we had, right? What about the Egyptians? They could build the greatest monuments in human history, the pyramids. They had tremendous scientific achievements, advancements. They had great pharaohs, great kings. They had good technology. What happened to them? They allowed the Persians and then the Greeks to overrun them, and then the Arabs. What happened? They also had great advanced weaponry. What about the Greeks? The Greeks had Sparta. We are Sparta. They had the great Spartan warriors. They had the phalanxes. They had those ramming galleys. They had such great technology. What happened to the Greeks? The Greeks are also said to be great mathematicians and so on. What happened? So were the Egyptians. What about South America? The Aztecs, the Incas, they also had great technology. They had a calendar system that went back thousands of years. They also had huge pyramids. They also had science and all that. What happened to them? Why did they fall to the ragtag barbarian Europeans? What happened? So understand, my friends, from this pattern that I've shown you, that great culture, great civilization, great scientific advancements, all that is not something that will prevent your culture and your nation from being destroyed. You need the right kind of leadership. If your scientists are great, if your universities are the best in the world, and your culture is the best, most advanced and richest culture in the world, but your leader is preoccupied with culture and having fun and is neglecting the armed forces, then no matter how great you are, you're going to be wiped out by by a bunch of desert warriors who have no culture, or snow warriors who have no culture. Okay, that's the deal. So that's as simple as that. So one thing is, yeah, the main thing is leadership. And you may have great leaders, but if that leader is not in power, in control of the whole country, and if you have multiple kingdoms and it's all fragmented and not politically united, then once again you're going to fall victim to a barbarian enemy who is focused only on one thing: warfare. So technology, culture, all that doesn't matter. You need, for a nation like India, you need a centralized power system, an imperial system essentially, and you need a proper focus on national defense, on the military, and on keeping an eye on the threats outside of your country. That's what needs to happen. And that's how. So when the Turks invaded India, India was not politically united like it was during the Maurya Empire, the Kushan Empire, the Gupta Empire, and so on. India was at the time going through that period of political fragmentation. So you had lots of kingdoms, smaller kingdoms, and no one great leader in the country. And also, we were too civilized. We used to fight. We had rules for fighting. We would not fight at night. We would not stab a running enemy, a fleeing enemy in the back. We would be merciful and so on. Our objective was to be brave and chivalrous and cultured, and the objective of the enemy was to win. So somewhere so it's a question of the quality of leadership and nothing more. Ruthless leadership. Anand Unayar says, how does excavation takes place? Do archaeologists know they will find specific things beforehand if they dig there, or do they find things by accident? For example, excavation of ancient sites, excavation of temple idols, even excavation of potteries from backyards of homes. How do they manage to pinpoint all these sites? Good question. Archaeologists usually do not randomly go and start digging anywhere. They don't do that. They dig on what is called promising sites. So there is some historical context, for example, to these to the place where they're going to dig. For example, in all across India, you will find these mounds. These mounds are ancient sites that generally are soil covering an ancient temple or a stupa or something. So when you see these mounds that arise out of nowhere, you typically know that there is something there which is archaeologically interesting. And then you obviously have sites that have this historical reputation of having been historically very significant. So we have the oral history because our records have been burned in the destruction of the university. So we have these oral records and oral lore. So because of these things, and then you can do underwater sonar surveys, you can do lidar mapping of underground artifacts and so on and so forth. So you can do certain things before you start to dig somewhere. But generally, you only dig when you know that this site is a promising site because of the factors that I just outlined. Some of the factors are the ones that I outlined, and there may be other factors as well when it comes to this. So that's how we do it. You don't randomly start digging just about anywhere, even though that could also work in India because India is so old. But generally, you start because of the scarcity of resources, money, funding, etc. You only dig where you are pretty certain to find something good. So you look at a site you identify sites that you will dig based on how promising they are, based on the already known factors. That's how we do it. Chandani Priya says, what should our country's strategy to have good and friendly relations with Russia and China and also some European countries which are friendly towards us be? Be friends with everybody. That's it. Win-win cooperation, mutually beneficial relationship, trade, economics, strategic affairs, everything should be mutually beneficial, and we should try to be friends with everybody. That should be our straightforward strategy. Next, as a 30-year-old Indian citizen, what can I teach my children so that they can be responsible for their actions and their actions towards our nation? Look, there's so much you can teach, and it's very difficult. But the most important thing I would say is teach your children our culture. Teach them their mother tongue. They should know how to read and write in their mother tongue, and teach them their culture, expose them to our cultural heritage in whatever ways. Read the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, whatever to them, or whatever it is that your family, tradition is, and make them familiar with their mother tongue, whatever mother tongue you have, and if possible, Sanskrit also. And I know it's easier said than done. Today, children are already, you know, they're already shouldering enormous burdens of education. So much they have to study, so much homework, so much curricular nonsense, and more 80 or 90% of what they are being forced to study is going to be of no use to them in the future. So it is a pointless, worthless, useless education system, but children have to go through this, and to put this on top of that is going to be an extra burden. So it's easier said than done, but that's what you should do if you can. Teach your children our culture, our heritage, expose them to this from an early age, and that will make them better citizens overall. Okay, done with the questions from the comments. Now let's take some questions from the live chat. So, my dear friends, I'll take about 10 minutes or so um, of your live chat questions. So, go ahead. Please ask me questions in the live chat. Let's take this one by Tipu Master. Years later, what's going on at and what's deployed at the Farkhor and Aini air bases in Tajikistan? Given their location, they seem extremely well placed to develop for pincering. Let's take a look at Aini and Farkhor. So, where is Aini air base? Where is Farkhor air base? They are air bases in, I believe, Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. I think Tajikistan. Okay, let's see. Farkhor air base. So, zoom, there you go. So, it is in Tajikistan on the border with Afghanistan. And this is the Farkhor air base. Now, let's go to the map view and see if we can discern the air base. Where is it? Not that visible, is it? I remember seeing the air base in the past. It's got to be somewhere here. That's strange. How is it Farkhor? Let's see. Okay, where could this be? I have seen that in the past. Has it been erased off the map? Okay, so it looks like I'm not able to locate it right now. It should be visible at the 1 kilometer or so range somewhere here. And I remember it was along the border with Afghanistan. I remember that. Okay, let's take a look at Aini. Aini, Ayni. So where is that? Okay, this one is more visible. So this is Aini Air Base. Is it near Dushanbe? So let's zoom in. So this one is very visible. Do we have any air assets over here? These are clearly military helicopters. These are clearly Soviet vintage aircraft, MiGs of some kind, etc. Are these Tajik assets or are they Indian assets? Not very sure. Let's see what we have here. These are not combat aircraft. These are aircraft of some other kind. So this airbase is clearly operational. Aini. When it comes to the Farkhor airbase, I'm not sure what's going on there. So Farkhor is on the border with Afghanistan. The other one is much further into Tajikistan. So that's the deal. I can show you only what's visible from here. I don't know what's happening because I'm not part of the government and I'm not privy to privileged information. They are obviously very well placed for, let's say, pincering. So if you look here, it's you can reach Pakistan from there in a matter of minutes if you are on a supersonic fighter plane, and that's why these air bases are important for India. So that's what I can say. I don't know really what this latest status is, but yeah, that's where they are. Uh, okay, let's take some of the questions. Maybe two, three more questions. Only Gem says, this is Pramod from Kerala. Why don't you meet Mr. Modi and share your suggestions about reforming our education system? We'll support you and do our responsibility to the nation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The thing is, Mr. Modi is a person who is in incredible demand. Everyone wants to meet him, and he doesn't have the time to meet everybody. And who am I? Who am I? I'm just some guy, right? So maybe in the future, if I'm fortunate, I may meet Mr. Modi. I may have the privilege to meet him. But yeah, that's the deal. So that's what I can say. He's not someone who's easy to meet. He's the top leader in the nation. His time is extremely valuable. He has so much work to do. His time is very regimented. Every day is planned out with very, very, very important things. And that's why it's very, very hard to meet him. So I was there in Rashtrapati Bhavan last weekend. I was there at Mr. Modi's inauguration and the swearing in ceremony of the Modi 3.0 cabinet ministers and ministers of state. And yeah, I was there, but meeting him, maybe it may happen someday if I'm fortunate in the future. And if I do meet him someday, I will certainly express my opinion as to what needs to happen. But I really appreciate your support. I really does. I really does. We does appreciate your supports. We does. Yes, indeed. Yes, precious. Yes, precious. Okay. Anisha says in Maharashtra, a famous Balochi person lives. Parikshit Balochi. Okay, all right. Um, Somi Jen says, is Macron a good leader? He's not a bad leader. He's an okay leader, I would say. He's doing the best he can in the context of the geopolitical situation that's prevalent in the world right now. That France is not a fully sovereign nation. It's part of the European Union. It's also part of NATO. So much of its sovereignty is gone by being part of two organizations that take away some of your sovereignty. And overall, the US it it rules Europe, Western Europe. So in the context of all of that, that situation, whatever he can do, he's doing for his country. From that perspective, he's a reasonably good leader, but not a great leader by any means, but a good leader for sure. Not a bad leader. Okay. What else do we have? You have questions, you ask me now. Good questions, yes. Um, Naman Jain says, could the promotion of Hindi be strategically better in the 1940s to unite India linguistically while retaining the native language of every state, or could it have been another language? Look, if you want a language that is universally understood and accepted, it's not Hindi, it's Sanskrit. Today, they have engineered the nation in such a manner that it's now Hindi. But if you were in the 1940s, Sanskrit was a much better option. But in the past 70 years, they've made Hindi the whole thing. Hindi is just, well, it's a language that's spoken in some parts of India, native to a small part of India, and it has got lots of dialects. So it was by no means the right choice for being the official or quasi-official language of India. It is the Hindustani language. It's Hindi, Urdu, and so on. The only right choice is Sanskrit. But nah. Um, Gautami says, our children in the West taught the correct history that shapes them. Even in the West, they're not taught the correct history. History, the way you teach history is a potent tool by which you can indoctrinate people and shape their worldview. So history, that's why it's so important. That's why history is so important. The way you teach history. One example is Germany. I've spoken about this like 3-4 years ago, I think, on one of my earliest live streams. I think the top between 1 to 50 episode number. So in Germany, there was a battle. I think in around 10 AD, 10 AD, and it was a battle between various Germanic tribes. They fought together against the Roman Empire, and their leader, the leader of the Germanic tribes, was a guy who had lived some part of his childhood as a hostage to Rome. So he was familiar with Roman culture, etc. His name was Arminius in Latin and Hermann in German. So this guy, he led this coalition of Germanic tribes in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest and decimated 3 entire Roman legions. The Varian legions. Varus was their commander, Varus. And when this happened, when Varus realized what the hell has happened, he did the natural thing and he fell on his sword and committed suicide. So I think the year 2010, plus or minus 1 or 2 years, was the 2000th anniversary of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in Germany. And almost no one in Germany celebrated this. Why is that? Because they're not taught their history. Because God forbid the Germans become nationalists again. When the Americans think about German nationalism, they see those Hugo Boss uniforms and those marching boots. Germany must never be allowed to rise again. So don't teach them their correct history. So even in the West, they don't teach the right history. Good, very good point you've raised here, Gautami. Jitu Chetri says China says that it will build 1,000 J-20 fighter planes, Generation 5 fighter planes by 2035. While see, quantity has a quality of its own, especially when the quality is good. So even if you have a MiG-21 class fighter, I'm not saying the MiG-21 itself, which is obsolete, very old, but something of that class, of that caliber, and you have 2,000 of those, it's a formidable challenge for any enemy. So quantity has a quality of its own. That's what Joseph Stalin said, and he was right. So the Chinese are doing the right thing. What about us? How many? 36 Rafales. 36 Rafales. And maybe 36 more in the next 10 years. What are we doing? We need to spend more of our GDP, our budget on the military. It is imperative we do that. And we need to boost the number of warheads we have. Those warheads, the spice warheads. We need 1,000 of those. Anyway, that's where we are now. Dr. Jayashankar says Modi's Italy visit. Yes, Mr. Modi has, I think he's still there, or is he back? I'm not sure, but he was in Italy on the invitation of Madame Meloni for the G20 summit. Sorry, the G7 summit. So whenever the G7 summit happens, it used to be the G8, but they've expelled Russia from that. So it's a G7 now, and Mr. Modi was there, and he took center stage in the group photograph and so on, and he met with various leaders, and the memes are out. I think Madame Meloni enjoys the memes. Why not? It's good to see a politician with a sense of humor. So yeah, so they are kind of feeding the memes in India, and so overall it was a good visit. He met Monsieur Trudeau, he met Monsieur Macron, Mr. Modi met with the old, sorry, President Biden. He met Madame Meloni, he met everybody that was of any importance, and I think it's good uh, to touch base with the major world leaders. So it's interesting that India is usually invited to the G7, but Russia is not and China is not. That tells you certain things. Okay, that tells you certain things. Okay, Prachit says how to exactly read books effectively. The philosophy or the methodology to read books is very simple. Open a book, and before you start reading a book, you should have some idea of what you want from this book. Why am I reading this book? Number one, you should know. Secondly, what am I hoping for in this book? And third, you should allow yourself to forget everything if the book is not valuable, if you don't get what you seek from the book. So my philosophy is very simple. I take a new book. I don't have to finish the whole book. I may put it aside after chapter 2 if it's not interesting, or I may skim through the chapters and see if there is something in there that is of any use to me. And maybe there's something, maybe 10% of the book is good, or relevant to me. I will read that and I'll leave the rest behind. I'll leave the rest aside. And even if I read an entire book, I'm perfectly okay with forgetting everything if it doesn't interest me. So that way I am sure that I will remember what I find interesting. And that's typically the stuff that I think is important. So that's how I do it. That's how I've always done. I've read thousands of books. I'm sure I've forgotten 80-90% of what I've read, but some of that has gone in, some of that, little bit. Small brain, you see. So that's how you read books. That's how I read books, and maybe that will help you also. Okay, I think I am gonna wrap it up now. So thank you once again to everybody for all your questions, for participating as usual. Apologies to those of you whose questions I could not take. I see thousands of questions coming in every week. I can only take a handful. So sorry to those of you. There are lots of good questions that I can't take every week. So apologies to those of you whose questions I could not take, but I will take as many questions in the future as possible, and we will keep on doing the Ask Abhijit show. So thank you so much once again, and I will see you very soon next week in the next episode of Ask Abhijit. Until then, take care and keep raising your standards. Thank you. Bye. Good day. Good night. See you soon.